Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartiya, and we are here at the Spinnaker Summit in San Diego. And today we have with us once again Andy Glover. You are Director of Delivery Engineering at Netflix. First of all, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now the event itself is growing,
Yeah.
but there is something interesting that you just completed 6 years at Netflix.
I did.
Before I talk about Spinnaker, I want to talk about you for a second.
Sure.
Talk about your journey at Netflix.
Yeah, it's been amazing. So, obviously, more than 6 years ago, I was contacted by an old friend who had recently taken a director role at Netflix, and she contacted me and said, I have this great opportunity. I think you should consider it. And I had always wanted to go to the West Coast. So I'm from the East Coast. I had always wanted to go to the West Coast, the Valley, and see how the big successful tech companies operated. And so, I interviewed. Amazingly enough, got the job, and moved. My family, we all went to California. So we live in the Bay Area, and working at Netflix has been amazing. It's hard to believe it's actually 6 years this month. Amusingly enough, the lady that hired me, she's still at Netflix as well. I met her at a conference. And so, just going to conferences and networking and meeting great people, it's just amazing kind of what opportunities unfold in the future. 6 years at Netflix, and with the same team, delivery engineering. In fact, it was actually not called delivery engineering when I joined. It had a different name. And first couple of months, try to figure out kind of what are we going to do? What's our value to Netflix? And it became very apparent that there was an opportunity to centralize continuous delivery. There were a couple of different solutions at Netflix, and so we renamed the team to Delivery Engineering and set out to build this new thing, which we eventually called Spinnaker, and open sourced it probably about a year later. So it's been about 5 years, maybe 4 or 5 years. Dates slip my mind quickly. And it has just been a really, really fun journey, roller coaster ride in a good way, Yeah. And I think, as you were alluding to, what we were talking about beforehand, it still is going. So I wasn't going to say the culmination, but we had a really interesting event in the last year since you and I last talked. And that is, we donated Spinnaker to the Continuous Delivery Foundation, and it was a really interesting, journey to get to that point. So again, we open source. We partnered with a number of companies. Predominantly, the biggest partner was Google, but there were other companies that we were working with when we open source Spinnaker. Pivotal and Microsoft were two of them. Both are at the summit this year, and. So we released Spinnaker, and we were really, in retrospect, underestimated kind of like the level of response we'd get. It's been amazing. And it became evident probably about, let's say 2 years ago. Again, time, it's all relative.
It's relative, yeah.
About 2 years ago, that the next kind of stage or journey or step with Spinnaker was to put it in a neutral foundation. It was evident through a couple of different conversations that there were some large companies who viewed getting involved in the Spinnaker ecosystem as risky from the standpoint of it wasn't clear who owned it. Was it Google? Was it Netflix? And if it was Netflix, for example, what was Netflix going to do with this thing? Would Netflix close source it? Would Netflix, consider, charging for it? And of course, none of those would happen. But that's easy for me to say because I'm on the inside. And if you're a large enterprise looking to reduce risk, if I'm going to bet on this Spinnaker thing and put engineering resources behind this, I don't want to have this thing ripped out from underneath me. So it's I think at this point probably a well-established pattern to put successful growing open source projects in a neutral body. And in this case, the Continuous Delivery Foundation is part of the Linux Foundation. So it very much mirrors what we're seeing with the CNCF and Kubernetes. And so we being essentially Google and Netflix got together and said, hey, this makes a lot of sense. Let's look at donating it to the CDF, and we did that last March, I believe. So it's been amazing.
Right. So there are a couple of points. One was that the fear that companies bigger, and if you look at industry, the way things are, like companies get acquired, or sometimes VCs try to pull strings, so they can always flip. So putting your project into a neutral foundation does kind of credibility and confidence, and it helps. And then it also helps bringing more people to work on it. So if I'm not wrong, if you look at CDF, or Continuous Delivery Foundation, so Spinnaker is the anchor project, right? Kind of.
I don't think so, actually. I think the anchor project's probably Jenkins.
Okay.
Jenkins has just a gigantic install base and has been around for a healthy amount of time, much longer than Spinnaker. So I would say that Jenkins is the anchor project, and there are two others in addition to Spinnaker, being Tecton and Jenkins X, which makes it really exciting in that there's kind of a mix of projects all kind of focused on slightly different things.
Right. There are other projects which either compete or complement.
Yeah.
Which also means that it could become a kind of umbrella project where all the adjacent projects that work with Spinnaker can find a home. Where a lot of other companies are creating their own project. At some point they might want to open source or create it. So what do you think about the evolution of CDF itself?
Yeah, no, I think exactly what you're saying is an exciting prospect in the sense of creating an umbrella where different projects in the CI/CD space can come together. I think what needs to be done and what we're working on as a foundation is to figure out how can we, essentially componentize the various different systems and make them interoperable, so to speak. So Spinnaker does a lot of things really well, but there are things that Spinnaker doesn't do well. And there are undoubtedly, projects in the ecosystem out there that do those things that Spinnaker doesn't do very well. And it shouldn't come down to a this or that. It should be like a this and that conversations for enterprises. And so the promise of the CDF, or the goal, is to figure out, okay, well, how do we create an ecosystem where maybe things are interoperable or componentized, and you can take the best of the best and get like a this and a that. We're not there yet. It's going to take some time. We got to figure out that interoperability story. But I think the promise there is really exciting. And the way I see it is, if you look at continuous delivery, let's say at a 50,000 foot level, abstractly there are this notion of a pipeline, right? A workflow. And pipelines have something that trigger them. So they're stages, or not stages, excuse me, triggers. Triggers trigger a pipeline. And then a pipeline is made up of, let's just say, stages. That's Spinnaker terminology. One thing we should do and we are trying to do, I should say, as an umbrella foundation, is let's come up with some taxonomy. But I'll call them stages. And then those stages themselves are made up of smaller things we'll call tasks or something. If you take a step back and you look at, for example, the Jenkins ecosystem, they have this notion of a plugin, and the plugin ecosystem with Jenkins is astronomically exciting. It's just like this huge. There's innovations all over the place. Whatever you need to do, you can get. And so there's a lot of lessons there. But the idea being is, if imagine a continuous delivery ecosystem that was much like that, where you could plug in different things. So let's say Spinnaker has plugins for GitHub and Artifactory and Nexus, but you want to plug in for, Subversion. And the ecosystem itself has written this standard way to plug in. So you could take the plugin from this other project that works for Subversion or Perforce or something like that and plug it into Spinnaker, or vice versa. Spinnaker, let's say, has an Artifactory trigger. You could take that and plug that into Jenkins X or something like that. And then the stages is where it becomes really interesting, because continuous delivery is oftentimes seen as deployment. I can take this thing and I can deploy it to Azure or something or Kubernetes. And I think the real value of continuous delivery is that workflow. All the things you do before you deploy it. Deploying is actually quite easy. But ensuring that what you're deploying isn't going to break or, let's say, ruin your end user's experience. There's a lot of details that go into that, a lot of verification, if you will. And in the Spinnaker ecosystem, we've seen a lot of innovations in terms of the verifications people want to do, and they manifest themselves as individual stages. And undoubtedly, these other projects have the notion of a stage that do also really interesting things. So again, imagine this component framework where I could say, I am using Spinnaker, but I want to use this stage that Tekton built that does this really interesting validation. I want that in my Spinnaker pipeline, or vice versa. I'm using Jenkins X, and I want the automated canary analysis from Spinnaker, and I want to plug it into that. So I think that promise, while we're I was going to say far off from there, we're off from there. We'll get there, and I think that's really exciting. And I think if we can get there, when we get there, we will see just even more innovations.
In addition to these adjacent projects, Spinnaker itself is adding a lot of additional layers, as new use cases are coming in, because now people are using it. I was talking to Emily yesterday, Burns. So, which also means that Spinnaker might become even more complicated. Like Kubernetes, it is already. So, when you look at Spinnaker, the big roadmap, now it's in the community. What are your concerns that that as the users are coming in, you might lose focus, or it may become. So number one is, how do you want to enable users so that they come freely? At the same time, you do not stray from your vision, just the way Kubernetes community has done.
Sure. Yeah. No. Great segue into an awesome conversation. So, I think at a high level, we recognize this. This issue, right? It was actually quite easy when we were a small community, and in fact, when essentially Netflix and Google, were controlling most of, if not everything, with respect to the ecosystem. So it was easy to align on where we're going. There's more parties in the ecosystem now, which is phenomenal and what we want. But the cost, if you will, to get everyone kind of aligned is much higher, and it's apparent that we haven't necessarily done a great job up to now. So a couple months ago, we started having conversations at the steering committee and TOC level of like, hey, where are we going? How do we get everyone aligned? And it's okay if people want to go off and take these tangents, because that's the whole point of open source, is you can build on top of it, things and innovate. But as a community, which direction are we heading? And so we did put together a roadmap with major stakeholders in the ecosystem, but undoubtedly we've probably left off some. So we need to figure out how to get everyone's voices in there. Published it on our community GitHub repo, which is another thing we've been doing, is trying to make things more and more open to get visibility so people can see where we're going. But the larger issue, in fact, we had a steering committee and TOC dinner here at the summit, which was awesome. What we decided is, hey, look, let's come up with some high-level themes where we want to take Spinnaker. Be very clear in terms of, if we can, and this is going to take some time, figure out who's our target audience, because it can't be everyone. Either we go after, it's easy to say the Fortune 500s or something like that, and even saying going after is somewhat, we're an open source project. It's more of, who does Spinnaker make sense for? Make it very clear who we make sense for, but also who it may not make sense for, and then that makes it easy for those companies. And then, what are the high-level themes we're going after? And to your point about all the innovations going in there, is one of the biggest efforts from a tactical standpoint that we're doing in 2020, and it started this year, is this idea of a lean core fat ecosystem, because right now Spinnaker, it is extensible, but everything kind of is in one, let's say, package. So when you get Spinnaker, you get everything. And what we want to do is separate that out so you can get a lean Spinnaker and figure out what you want. And I think that will make at least Spinnaker itself probably easier to get started. And going to your earlier point about, it can get more complicated. I think right now it is kind of complicated. One high-level theme we've been talking about is, what's the experience for getting started with Spinnaker, both, or the path? Like, how do you install it? How do you get started with continuous delivery and the infrastructure management side? And then, how do you take it to the next level? Because there's getting started, and then there's different levels or paths you can go. How do you scale it? How do you become like a Netflix or another big company? And so I think what we'll be doing over the next coming quarters is as a community aligning around that, and then saying, here's what we're going after. And the we here would be filled in by not so much the companies, but the people or maybe even special interest groups behind it. Like let's improve the operator experience. Let's improve the install experience. Let's work on plugins so that we can pull out a lot of these interesting innovations, but make them kind of pluggable so you can take what innovations you want and keep the lean core simple and therefore easy to install and maintain and operate. So there's a lot of work over the next year or so. This is probably a multi-year project, but the fact that we are aligning around that is important because we hadn't done that in the past.
Early adopters of Netflix are all advanced users, but as it becomes, did I say Netflix or?
You did say Netflix.
Yes, early adopters of Spinnaker were, advanced users.
Yep.
But as it grows in popularity, a lot of people would want to use it.
Yeah.
So that's where the point of, it should be easy to use comes into, which also means that there is a space for a big ecosystem around it where people can be distributing it and building business model. So what are your thoughts about, commercializing Spinnaker?
I think it's exciting, and I'm all for it. So there are at least 2 companies, commercializing Spinnaker, and it's clear that there's a need for it. I've certainly over the years, before these companies, let's say, arose, people would come to me saying, "Hey, we want to do this thing, but we're looking for someone to help us. Are you aware of a company that can either help set us up or train us or add some extensions?" And so it's clear there's a market need, and I think it's a sign of a healthy ecosystem in that you can have commercial companies. So from a open source community standpoint, it's important that we recognize that there are opportunities for people to commercialize these things, and that's great. And let's all make sure we get our, let's say, incentives and motivations on the table. And I think the companies in the space have done a great job of doing that. So, for example, when we look at roadmaps and where we're going, it's helpful for people to understand kind of what's the motivation, why do you want that? And I've always tried to maintain a very transparent, or I should say I've tried to maintain transparency with respect that, I speak both for Netflix, but I try to also speak, let's say, for like the broader community, but I need help there. But in terms of like, as a community, if we all understand where we're taking Spinnaker and why we want to take it there is important so that we can have, again, transparency and trust, right? So, and I think that's been let's say the cultural adjustment for open source, and I've seen this in other projects, is when you have, let's say, benevolent companies like Netflix and Google. Let's say Netflix. We don't have a commercial interest in Spinnaker. We just want innovation out of it. We're never going to charge for it or anything like that. But then there are other companies, let's say, in the ecosystem that obviously, or maybe not obviously, but they have a goal, right? Netflix wants innovation, but let's say a large cloud vendor wants to do the right thing, is benevolent and putting resources in it. But I think it should be clear that they also want to drive compute. Everyone has to put food on the table. And then the commercial companies in the space who want to make money off of, let's say, value-added services on top also want to make money. So getting that on the table, I think, reduces, let's say, the mistrust that can pop up when a large player says, "Hey, we want to add this thing," and you have some people who are, "Why would you want to add that? It doesn't make any sense." And then if you understand, well, they need to drive, let's say, value or compute or whatever it is. I think it becomes easier then for us to figure out, okay, how can we find the middle ground where you can add these things and we can add these things and we all win. And so, again, I think it's great that there are commercial companies, and I think the challenge of any open source ecosystem is for those parties to have open and honest communication of, this is why we're innovating in this way. And the commercial companies, or there's actually more than 2, I should say, by the way. There are just 2 solely focused on Spinnaker, but there are plenty of commercial companies, working on Spinnaker, but, for various reasons. But getting open and honest communication, understanding kind of why, let's say, stakeholders make decisions, I think just makes it easier to understand and work together.
Yeah, these days when it comes to open source, this discussion is becoming important. I was talking to Chris Wright from Red Hat, CTO Red Hat, and we had a discussion about commercialization of open source because that is critical for the sustainability of open source. And I was talking to Linus Torvalds or Greg Hardman, and they said, we want selfish users of Linux because when you are doing something out of charity, when you lose interest in the charity, you'll just walk out.
Yeah.
But if you have vested interest in the project, your contribution is not out of charity. It's so he was like, whether it's Microsoft or Netflix or Amazon, whoever is contributing, we want those contributions because they get some value out of that too.
Yep.
So I think that is true for Spinnaker as well.
That's great. I love that. Articulating exactly like that is good. You want, and again, understanding why a particular entity or whatever is selfish is important. It's like, yeah, because exactly, I couldn't agree more. And of course, those stalwarts of open source would have that, would say it like that, and I'm glad to hear that because I think exactly like that.
Right. Now let's go back to Spinnaker Summit. You started in a small hotel, right? Where it was, we talked about it. Now we are here, and it's like next to KubeCon.
Yeah.
Kind of almost co-hosted event, and KubeCon I think will have like 10,000 people.
Yeah, it's huge.
So, and I'm pretty sure that in 1 or 2 years, Spinnaker will also grow as the adoption is growing. So, as you mentioned initially that, the person who hired you met at an event, So what role do these physical events play? Why you continue to create a Spinnaker Summit when people can just work remotely?
Yeah, it's all about just connecting, right? It's like, so going back to what does Netflix want, but I think what does anyone want in an ecosystem is a vibrant community because we get innovations out of it. And a vibrant community, certainly you can do remotely, There are plenty of people I've never met that I have relationships online with, so to speak. But there's something about like getting together as a community and having like these, ad hoc, serendipitous conversations that just bring people together in a special way. So really this is about, building a strong community in an intimate fashion, so to speak. There's nothing like just hanging out, going to a session with a bunch of people, learning something new from some amazing company, whatever, Airbnb or something like that, hearing what they're up to, and then having like a conversation with like Sony or somebody, afterwards being like, hey, that was really interesting. How are you doing this? And those kind of conversations, while they can happen online, I think are just more, let's say, fruitful in like face-to-face. We're all in these rooms, we're having these discussions, or you walk up to a booth and you just start talking with somebody. So that's, I think, the real value is building these strong relationships. I've had, at this point, countless conversations and all these follow-ups. I've got all these emails. I'm going to talk to this person later, and we will have these virtual conversations later. We'll jump on a Google Meet, and talk more. But like the connection was made at a conference like this, and so it's just supercharged at like a KubeCon. These are valuable experiences. I'm so happy that we're having this. Every year it gets better and better. And I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Now you have people from Netflix or Google who have been, they have vast experience with Spinnaker. Then new people are coming in.
Yep.
Some are new users. They don't know. At the same time, it's not very pleasant, but some people want to move on. But they will take their experience with them.
Yeah.
So do you have any plan where you can have a kind of mentorship program where, the experienced, contributors, they can, hand over the baton to the next generation, or new users can comfortably, come to these events like that and talk to, because a lot of people who are using and they just go on GitHub or ask questions.
Yeah, so I think the short answer is, do we have a formalized plan, let's say, for mentoring? Not yet. And I think we should. But the other answer is, I think we're doing a lot of things to help with that, just not directly stitching them together, saying, hey, here's how we create the next generation, let's say, of approvers. I think we have all the pieces in place, and I think formalizing it would be great. Because you're right. And let me take a step back. So one of the things we're trying to do in 2020 is lower the barrier to entry. And to do that, we have to make, again, this lean core fat ecosystem. So this whole idea around plugins. And plugins is actually, the word itself is probably limiting in terms of the scope of the effort. In fact, what we're calling it is kind of Spinnaker as a platform, which I think implies a larger scope. But the idea is not only in addition to plugins, but clarifying APIs, clarifying how you can extend Spinnaker both like at the UI level, within Spinnaker, even like how you can put things underneath it, so to speak. So it is a very large effort, with the express goal of making extensibility easier and lowering the barrier to entry so that we can get more people innovating. And then one of the things we've also recognized is like the onboarding experience, going back to earlier, is like this path of how you get going with Spinnaker. It's clear there's plenty of opportunities to make it easier in terms of documentation and whatnot. So I think we're doing, or at least we recognize a number of paths or initiatives to make it easier for the community to onboard. And I think adding a level of mentorship there in this kind of how do we get people in the ecosystem, and then when they're ready to move on, which is, we've all been in open source projects where eventually we, whatever our interests go elsewhere or whatever, and how do we continually refresh or build a bench, I think is something we should focus on as a community. And so I appreciate you bringing that up, and I know Emily's passionate about that. So I know we have the right people that could do something like that, and I think it'd be amazing. And I think also doing that in a more formal way, I think also creates a more inclusive community, which is something we have been talking about for, since before we joined the CDF, is, again, how do we get more people in the ecosystem? Because again, laying everything out on the table from a transparency standpoint is, we, Netflix, want more innovation. And when we get more innovation, not only does Netflix win, but everybody wins. And to get more innovation, lower barriers so more people can get in and get a diverse audience, because that's where you see the real innovation, is people coming in from whatever. Diversity takes many different forms, but like coming in from, let's say, even different domains, it just becomes fascinating. So
yeah, you would not even know that, hey, why are they using Spinnaker?
Yeah.
Suddenly you'll see your use case and I'm like, oh, wow,
Yeah.
I did not even think about it. The one problem with the open source is that when people move, I have seen that in Linux community, even they move from Red Hat to SUSE to Microsoft, they still work on the same kernel.
Yeah.
So you see the same old people I saw in Linux, and I was like, the whole developer base is aging. He said, the thing is people move, but they don't leave kernel,
Yeah.
They move from company to company. So it happens with open source a lot, where people do change companies, but still continue to work on the same project.
Yeah.
So.
It's interesting, you bring up, Linux and Red Hat, or Linux as let's say, an open source project, and then Red Hat as a commercial entity on top. So my team and I had a really interesting discussion about what are some great open source projects that we can learn from? And I think it's great that you've brought up Linux, because I think that is a phenomenal open source project where there's a ton of lessons to be learned from that, both from the standpoint of how it's governed, and then the ecosystem around it, how it succeeds. But there's other great examples. You also mentioned Kubernetes is also a very interesting open source project where we can learn from. The whole Node project came up. React came up. So there's a lot of really interesting open source ecosystems that have both pros and cons. And there's a lot of lessons you can learn from them. And so we're looking at them and figuring out what are we doing well and what are we not doing well, and how can we do those things that we're not doing well better. Mm-hmm. And I think it also goes back to understanding the commitment needed to build a healthy ecosystem. And it's higher than most people think. It's never if you build it, they will come. But when you do build this thing of value, people, and you make it very clear and you get some momentum, and then you lower barriers, you'll get more and more, and then you have new problems, so to speak, or challenges is probably a better way of saying it. And you have to kind of readjust. And we're doing that as a community. Again, we started out with a few stakeholders, and the stakeholders have grown, and that creates new challenges that we have to adapt and figure out how to still have this vibrancy. And again, there's plenty of lessons learned if you look through history.
Right. One thing that I liked about Linux, and one of the reasons was I was an early Linux user, and when I started Linux, I was talking with the project, so he said, first of all, I don't have any vision. No, but in a different way. But what he meant was that not only just with the code I enable you, I let you bring your vision to kernel.
Yep.
I don't have a next goal for where Linux wants to go. I enable the users. They can take Linux wherever they want to. I am here just to say no to a lot of things. He said most of the time I just say no to things, which keeps the whole kernel intact. So these are certain things that I like about it, because Linux itself is a kind of unorthodox project.
Yeah.
They don't have any structured governance model. It's a very
benevolent dictator.
Yeah. So, but it worked.
You're right. It does.
But it will not work in every case also, because
Yep.
you may not have a leader.
Well, it's interesting to hear that his job is to say no, because I've been asked on a number of occasions kind of what lessons have you learned, both within, let's just say Netflix, but also within, the Spinnaker ecosystem. And I think, I know that one of my answers is I should have said no more often. And that's a valuable life lesson. But I like the aspect of, him saying, I don't necessarily have a vision, it's up to the users. And I can empathize with that from the standpoint of me and my team certainly had a vision in the beginning, and certainly have a vision, but like in the beginning, our vision was very focused on continuous delivery for server-side applications. We knew that we wanted to make things pluggable because we had learned some lessons from previous projects, and we didn't really think through and that's the beauty of innovation, is we didn't think about all the different, let's say, ways you could plug in. But I love to tell the story in the sense of an engineer came to me and said, hey, at Netflix, could we add the notion of feature flags into Spinnaker? Like those could be the input, so to speak, to a delivery workflow. Because again, the value had already been established that continuous delivery is not about deployment, it's about the workflow, the things you do before you deploy. And we at Netflix had seen or learned this lesson that feature flags can break production, so to speak. And so why not put them through a pipeline where you could validate that they ultimately don't break production, so to speak, or degrade your experience as a member watching something on Netflix. And so he came to me and suggested that we integrate our feature flag framework into Spinnaker. And I'll be honest with you, when he first said it to me, I was skeptical. I was like, well, I don't see how this makes sense. Of course, in retrospect now, I'm like, it makes total sense. But that's this idea of if you can build a platform and make it extendable, and then create an approachable atmosphere when an engineer can come to you and say, I've got this vision, I've got this idea. And thankfully, I didn't say no, although I was skeptical, and we did some experiments, and then within time I saw the value, and now I'm a huge proponent of yeah, you should be running feature flags through this. It's all about software delivery, and that's just one example of, again, I think to Linus's point, that as project, let's say, stakeholders, being open to these innovations, and also being willing to say no. And I have said no, or we have said no as a community in the past, but we probably could do a better job there.
Right. A good example was ARM, when ARM came to the kernel, and because they wanted to consume resources, power, and everybody was like, what? Now Intel and AMD, data centers are saving millions of dollars because of the efficiency that ARM brought to the kernel. So yeah, you never know. So before we wrap this interview, I am curious what your pipeline, not your pipeline, but your roadmap or your vision is for 2020.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to a number of the things that you and I just talked about, in the sense of, this is a growing community. It's astounding how it's growing. It's really exciting and humbling, both in terms of just look at just the pure stats of Slack growth, PR growth, contributor growth, and then stakeholders coming to the table. So the major goals in 2020 are to lower the barriers. I think this idea of Spinnaker as a platform, or just let's say extensibility, is huge, because if you look at Spinnaker at Netflix, we run off head, so we use the same Spinnaker that everyone else uses, but we build a ton of things on top of it, in it and underneath it, so to speak, and because we've extended it to the hilt, and we want to make it really easy for other people to extend it and add just tremendous value on top of Spinnaker, and then we'll also see lots of innovation if we can make it easier. So, and then the other thing I think is certainly a priority as a community and a steering committee, let's say Spinnaker governance, is to kind of clarify, or to more clearly articulate, what are the big things we're going after. We have a roadmap, it's very tactical, but what are the big themes as a community we want to address? And I think the real important thing there is to clearly articulate what we're going after, and then what we're not. And the not is good from the standpoint of there's no ambiguity. Whatever this use case, take example, we're not gonna address as a community, or at least the major stakeholders aren't going to address it, and the community can either choose to address it, or it then clarifies the choice. Okay, well, maybe Spinnaker is not for me, and that's hard for us to, for people to admit, but I think it's important. And so we're going to work as a community to do that. make it very clear here are the use cases or whatever it is that is great for Spinnaker, and then here are other use cases that it's probably not good for, and then there are plenty of options out there, and they're awesome for those use cases. So that's, I think, 2020, if I could wrap it up. There's a ton of other stuff going on in 2020, don't get me wrong, but at a high level, it is certainly lowering the barrier, increasing the level of, let's say, investment or innovation going into Spinnaker. I love the idea of this mentor thing. I think that's part of it in terms of building this bench of strong innovators, and then clarifying kind of as a community, where are we going? Not very detailed, but at a high level, a theme level, and that will take some time because there's definitely a lot of, let's say, wrangling there. But and I'm looking forward to that challenge.
Awesome. Good luck with that.
Thank
and
you.
Once again, Andy, thanks for sitting down with me and talking to me. And I look forward to seeing you again at the next Spinnaker Summit.
Yeah, man, it's always a pleasure.
Awesome.
Thank you.